Okay, fascism. We're starting. Hello. I'm Will. Obviously, you know that. But in case you're psychotic enough to share this with people that you know, that's who I am. We're talking about fascism. And first of all, thanks for joining because this is literally something that I was just reading a lot about. And then I was like, I need to do something with this knowledge. Let me berate everyone I know to the idea of maybe having some sort of talk about it, which is intellectual hubris at its finest. But I do therefore appreciate that you actually showed up and seem interested. So, hey, look at that. Maybe I'll learn something. This could either take like 15 minutes or it could take like an hour and a half. It probably won't do that, but who knows? This is one of those things where I've prepared slides. There are 33 of them, including transition slides, to be fair, but I don't know how much each one will take. So, hey, mazel tov. Let's go. So, quick agenda. Everyone loves an agenda. Who doesn't? We're going to talk about why we're going to talk about fascism, which is really great, talking about why we're talking about something. Then we're going to cover everything that I actually read, sort of. Then we're going to talk about some basic interpretations of what fascism is, like what the trajectory of our talk is kind of going to be and where it's coming from, because people have thought about fascism in a bunch of different ways, and we can't really try to come to grips with it without going through the initial groundwork to actually try to understand where people are thinking about fascism from. Yeah. So then we're actually going to get into the meat of things too. So we're breaking up sort of our discussion of fascism as a whole into three key parts. We're going to cover fascist ideology and early fascism. We might include some historical notes about fascism here too. It depends on how I'm feeling. Then we're going to talk about the fascists coming to power, how that actually works, and what it looks like, and different means that they use to do that. And then once they're in power, we're going to talk about fascist radicalization, which is very cheery. That's where even more people start getting killed. But we'll talk about how that works and the way that that informs state, society, and the individual. Wow, what fun. And then I have a closing area about truth, which I'm sure will just seem so very navel-gazy, which is great. Cool. So why talk about fascism? Well, this entire thing was spurred by the election, obviously, which means that like any sort of intellectual pursuit, it's like 6 months out of date and not useful to anyone except conceptually. So that's really, really good on me for doing my work beforehand. But the election cycle really like spurred some reasons to talk about fascism because the term became very popular. Like if you've been paying attention at all for the last like 5 or 6 years, and especially over the last 4, people talk about fascism all the time. And that's great on one hand because it means that we're separating fascists from just straight up Nazis, because there is a slight difference. It's bad because we have to do that because there are like straight up Nazis again. So it's like, oh, we can't just call everyone a fascist because they're Nazis now. Great. Love society and the way it's going. But the thing is that fascism is such an amorphous term that just using it colloquially has become sort of, I don't want to say useless, but decontextualized, and it loses a lot of its power when people just call anything fascist. Because not anything is fascist. Fascist is very specific and it's very dangerous. The thing about fascism is that I do think it's legitimately the most dangerous form of politics. And so like just talking about it and figuring out how it works and what's going on can be really important. And fundamentally, I just kind of wanted to. So that's why we're doing it. So what I've read, here's some stuff. It's a lot of things. Look, hyperlinks, isn't that great? So these are all books, as you might imagine, and this is an article. This is Umberto Eco's Fascism. This is sort of a foundational text in trying to define what fascism is. I probably will email out this deck because this link just has a PDF in it. So if you want to read anything about fascism, just read this. It's like 9, 10 pages, and it's very, very good. A big book that I base a lot of my own thinking on is Robert Paxton's The Anatomy of Fascism. It's also the most recent thing here, really. And it's a very good book. We'll talk more about that. Read some stuff by Ian Kershaw, who has a lot of things specifically about Nazism, but he talks a lot about the interpretation of Nazism as fascism in some of his books. Read a good amount of Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. It's like 600 pages. It's very long, but it's very helpful. Big fan of Hannah Arendt, despite her problematic stuff. How Fascism Works is like a polemic, basically, that was written last year by a Yale historian. It's like 120 pages long. It's quick, but I wouldn't say it's great. It doesn't actually bother defining what fascism is. It instead just sort of talks about like how fascist politics works, which I don't think is very useful if you don't try to at least define what it is. Anyway, the next book is one that any of my grad school friends will hate me for putting on here, which is The Rites of Spring. Yeah, Megan knows what's up. Very divisive book, this. It's kind of bad history, but I think it's a great book. So I don't know. It's very complicated. It's all about culture and society and how it led to things, which means it's very blobby. Anyway, yeah, and then I've been thinking about this for a long time, so there's other things that I read too. So let's actually talk about fascism and how people thought about it in the past, because that's going to be really useful base work for us to actually talk about what it means. So the first thing that we have to contend with is fascism is totalitarianism. Just if you ask anyone to define what totalitarianism is, they kind of can't, and that's why I don't find totalitarianism valuable as an analytical tool. Mussolini invented the word totalitarianism in the 1920s at some point, which is ironic because whenever you ask who the totalitarians really were, it's Stalin and Hitler. Mussolini is really kind of like the Yahoo of fascists because he came up with it, but then everybody did it better than him. Which you gotta feel a little bit bad for the guy in some ways, but then again, he's also Mussolini, so screw him. The reason why I don't think totalitarianism is very useful is because when you try to ask what totalitarianism means, people say, "Oh, well, it's what Hitler and Stalin did, and what they did was totalitarian." Then you ask, "Well, what did they do?" And the answer is they did totalitarian things, and you're just kind of like, "Great, that's basically tautology." Some other critiques of totalitarianism is that like the image of this all-encompassing state that like terrorizes everyone and coerces them doesn't apply to fascism all the time, and it really only defines Hitlerism and Stalinism really when they're in their most paranoid and internally bloodthirsty incarnations. So when we're trying to define fascism as a whole, that means it's not always that useful because while these regimes are horrible, it doesn't show their entire existence, if that makes sense. Also, like for the Cold War, totalitarianism got really popular because it allowed everyone to equate the Soviet Union with Nazis in a very easy way by saying that these things are the same phenomenon, which is a problematic history. But at the same time, like, is fascism totalitarian? Sure, whatever that chooses to mean. I just don't think it's that useful to dig into. I say that after digging into it, but here we are. Then we have to contend with the Marxist interpretation of what fascism is. And this really stems from the Bolshevik and Soviet interpretation of what fascism is. The Soviets pretty much immediately came out with a theory of fascism like the second fascism started. And really, it's sort of like what you would expect for a very political definition of what fascism is, where they're just like, this is failing capitalism trying to prop itself up. Aaron, mute yourself. And there's something to be said for that, when you're looking at the way that fascism functions, especially in the way that it hates communism and socialism in the left, it's not an unreasonable read. But at the same time, it presupposes a certain amount of omnipotence to the ruling capitalist class that, as we'll see as we go through this, just doesn't really hold up to historical scrutiny. So yes, there is something to be said for the harnessing of capitalist angst to fight off the left, but I don't think that that's the defining characteristic of fascism, and it's not the completest definition that we could go for. Comparative fascism is something that happened relatively recently. By that I mean like in the 80s, so that's history for you. But this is probably the biggest discipline of fascist study, and Umberto Eco is really sort of the poster child, that article that we have a link to in these slides. basically compares all the fascist regimes to try to pull out specific cogent points where it's like, oh, all of these things are the same across all these different boundaries. So that's why his article is called Fascism, being like the first human city. So like fascism is like primordial fascism, the basic fascism. Yeah, pretty useful. But the one critique that we can probably have with comparative fascism is that to start the project at all, you have to define what the fascists are, and depending on who you're defining and who you're comparing, you'll get different results, right? So that's something that's a little bit problematic, but by and large, pretty good discipline and pretty good way to think about fascism by comparing and contrasting everything. And then we have Paxton's phased approach. Like I said, I owe a lot to this book, The Anatomy of Fascism. And it is comparative, but it takes into account the fact that all political movements, organizations, everything like that, phenomena, they all change as time goes on, as our situation changes. No political thought is solid, and they're all relatively malleable. And if you're not malleable, then you won't get into power, and then people won't be talking about you, 100 years later, like we are now. So that just means that simply defining fascism by like Nazism in power, warps our understanding of what fascism is. We can't look at like the fall of Berlin and just the Holocaust and say that that's what fascism is. We also have to look at everything that came before it. First fascism like as a political party, and then we can get to fascism in power. So this is a bit squishy and amorphous, like this talk probably will be. And Paxton specifically like comes with a really explicit definition of what fascism is, and that kind of limits him in some ways, as I think we'll see, because let's define it. Fine, let's do it. So this is from Paxton's book, and he says, and I quote, "Fascism may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal constraints, goals of internal cleansing and external expansion." So if you walk away with anything, it's that. But I will say that Paxton takes his definition very literally. In his mind, because of things like that and between internal cleansing and external expansion, there's really, in his mind, only two fascist states, Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Nazi Germany. People like Francisco Franco to him aren't successful fascists because they don't care about external expansion, for example, or they are missing some of these. I think we can work with something that's a little bit more generalist than this restrictive view of things. Like we can take certain pieces out and slot maybe a few different things in, but by and large, this is a really great definition of what fascism is. And all of this really means is that fascism is part of the far right, with some caveats that we'll discuss that are actually kind of bonkers to think about. But it's part of the reason why it's an enduring philosophy. But it's called National Socialism, you libtard, some people say. Just want to get this out of the way. If anybody tells you that, ignore them. They are intentionally trying to manipulate you and acting in bad faith, and are probably maybe themselves a fascist. Who's to say? Part of the reason why I wanted to do this talk is to clear that up. I don't think anybody here is going to disagree with the opinion that fascists are far right. But, that said, there were some occasional critiques of capitalism and society that could be read as sort of left-leaning, and that's where some of the confusion comes up. But we'll talk about those and how they're mostly just political tools anyway and don't mean anything. Wow, that was long. So now we've talked about how to talk about fascism. Let's actually talk about fascism. Jesus. So we're going to talk about fascist ideology and early fascisms. A lot of things to talk about here first and foremost is that fascism is not a traditional ism, like we think about liberalism or republicanism or conservatism. And that's because fascism doesn't care about internal consistency in terms of thought. It's not something that takes itself that seriously as like a written political doctrine as we understand politics to work. it's inherently based on contradictory elements, and that is not a defect, it's a feature of fascism. And it's part of the strategy to get people to try to engage them on their terms in bad faith. So Paxton writes that fascism bears a different relation to ideas than the 19th century isms, and that intellectual position, not basic mobilizing passions like racial hatreds, of course, were likely to be dropped or added according to the tactical needs of the moment. All the isms did this. We can all think about isms that change a lot. Politics is always changeable. But only fascism had such contempt for reason and intellect that it never bothered to justify its shifts. So when you see people that are not caring about like consistency or hypocrisy in policy, this is part of the reason why, is because it fundamentally does not matter. And when we're talking about merging contradictions into one thought, that's what Umberto Eco calls syncretic thought, which is a religious idea that you can merge theologies together and come out with a positive whole while not caring about the differences. So syncretism is very important, and it's part of the reason why fascism is so hard to pin down and so hard to combat intellectually. Not to say that there weren't fascist intellectuals, but they were intellectuals that didn't care about intellectualism, which is interesting. So syncretism isn't just the combination of different forms of beliefs and practice, but it has to also tolerate contradictions. Oh, this is a direct quote from Umberto Eco that I didn't cite. Very good. Good job, Will. Professional. Each of the original messages contains a sliver of wisdom, and whenever they seem to say different or incompatible things, it alludes allegorically to the same primeval truth. That's a typo. This is all a typo. Great. So basically the idea is that it's fine when things are contradicting each other because the momentum and the sort of idea that your thought is gesturing at is fundamentally correct. So it doesn't matter if you're cramming things completely polar opposite to each other together, because what you're going for is solid in your mind. That's why the Nazis can take like a Hindu icon like the swastika and cram it into something like a Nordic pan-German movement, where it really should have no meaning whatsoever. It's because it's syncretic when you try to do that. So as a consequence of this sort of learning, for Eco at least, there can't be any advancement in learning. So the truth has already been spelled out once and for all, and we can only keep interpreting its obscure messages. And of course, for the fascists, the truth that's been interpreted is, according to my next slide, nationalism and mythology, or rather a mythological nationalism. So the truth that fascist thinking points towards is not necessarily how we would understand truth to be, which is something that has to be empirical. The fascist conception of truth is mystical, primordial, and fixated on the nation, however you define that. It's both a tactic and a worldview to do this. So nationalism is like one of the most difficult things to define. And part of the reason why is because of problems like this, where when you dig deep enough in what people mean by their nation, it eventually becomes mythic, where you can't debate it one way or the other, and the inclusion or exclusion of people into that nation is entirely arbitrary and based on the people that you're talking to. So for the fascist, mythology informs what the nation should supposedly be. For Germans, this is sort of almost a cliche at this point that the Nazis were like obsessed with Vikings and the Aryan, right? Whatever that means to them is what the nation is. So some of this nationalism is grounded in the real world, right? It's like some national impetus was historically based. Like Italian nationalism in some ways was because they didn't get the territory that they wanted at the end of the First World War that had Italian people in it. That's a more grounded idea of nationalism, that you're like, there are people that are of our nation living there. But when we get to something where we're looking at Wagner, that's not a grounded nationalism, right? That can be up to whatever interpretation you decide it to be. But more than just like mythology, this lends itself to a worldview that is inherently backwards looking. I think that's pretty obvious. But this turns not only into just being sort of slavishly conservative, but it also turns into what Umberto Eco calls a cult of tradition. where tradition isn't defined by what happened, 50 years ago in terms of policy. Tradition is defined by what you think the basic nature of humanity is, and humanity in this case is defined by who you think your nation is. Of course, that means that this tradition is false, right? Like nobody can say what traditional Germanness or Italianness or Frenchness or Americanness is, but the fascists will try because it's required in the mythological national worldview. And if all of this sounds like it's kind of gibberish, that's because it is. That means that fascism is, of course, deeply anti-intellectual, anti-democratic, and illiberal. If you're obsessed with tradition, you're not going to like democratic or parliamentary politics. You're not going to like women in the workforce, let alone any form of women's liberation. To a traditionalist cult, the only role for women, for example, is just pushing out babies for the nation, right? You see that in every fascist worldview, but in also every fascist government had massive organizations dedicated to like women's stuff, which on some ways it's like, yeah, you're organizing women. That's actually sort of progressive, that you're giving women any sort of view at all. But the view is so traditional that it becomes, meaningless, and deeply anti-feminist. Anti-democratic stuff is pretty clear here if we think about fascism as a mythological worldview, right? Like, where's democracy in any myth? There isn't. The only people that matter in a myth is the hero, right? It's part of the reason why so many fascists are drawn sort of by mistake in a way to Nietzsche, because he loved, or he came up with the idea of the Superman, and that's something that's very easy to transcribe back onto mythological pasts. And of course, this means everything's a liberal. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise. Duh. So another thing to take away here is that you shouldn't trust anyone who learns timeless human lessons about how like people work or societies work from myth. That is so fundamentally dangerous that it's hard to stress. So Joseph Campbell, who like wrote the book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, like very important work, right? Kind of fashy in his politics, actually. Like if you read about him a little bit more, kind of fashy. Jordan Peterson, straight up fascist. Why is a psychologist talking about mythology? Because he's a fascist, and thinks that by reading mythology psychologically, you can just like learn something about basic human psychology and how women are bad and stuff. And Julius Evola is like probably the most timeless example, mainly because he's the oldest and he's thankfully the most dead. And he was an Italian guy who came up with a lot of fascist thought back in the 20s. And he got put on trial after the war for being a fascist. And he said, I'm not a fascist, I'm an ultra fascist. And everyone's like, what the hell does that mean? And I think he got off because everyone's like, I don't know. But he was so fascist that he actually fell out with Mussolini, which is very fun. Greg, you have a hand up. What's going on, my dude?
Yay. I wanted to ask if a good example demonstrating this is the Nazi Party's like restriction of what they call degenerate art, like in the 30s, and they're like
Wow.
trying to destroy modern art. Oh, is that coming up?
It's the next slide, Greg. But no, you're exactly right.
I'm so
That's part of the
excited for
same
this.
movement. No, you're right. It's part of the same movement. So when you have a fixed idea of what like the nation is and what the values of that nation are, and they're unchangeable, and they've only been perverted by the progress of time and perverted by liberal ideology, whatever that means, then you can very easily say everything in the culture from this style or this look or this time period is degenerate, right? Um, and that's Wagner, in case you didn't recognize Wagner by sight. I don't, admittedly. But yeah, there's a reason why like Nazis were obsessed with Wagner. And it's because he himself was, I mean, a rabid anti-Semite for one, but also he provided like the template for art that to the Nazi was like pure national art because it was so fixated on Germanic myth. Um, and seemed timeless to them, which is kind of quaint. So it sort of begs the question that this very loosey-goosey book that lots of my grad school friends don't like sort of poses, and that is fascism the apotheosis of the modernist worldview, despite the fact that it hates modernism? And the reason why this is brought up is because before World War I and after World War I, too, you have this big movement in the arts that's all about channeling primeval energy. And it's all about expressing that too. That's why you have like the Rite of Spring happens at this time, and it's a massive conflagration, and lots of people hate it, but lots of people are enraptured by it. That's why this book is called Rites of Spring. And I think there's something to be said for that, that culturally, like Europe specifically, but like the Western world in general had reached a point analytically where it had sort of gone back on parts of the Enlightenment that was purely rational and was now entirely fixated on the purely emotional. Which, I don't know, I don't want to get into that too much because it is sort of loosey-goosey. But a good quote from this book is that Nazi kitsch may bear a blood relationship to the highbrow religion of art proclaimed by many moderns. Something to be said for that. I won't expand on that. That's all I have to say. Okay, so pay attention. When we're talking about mythology, this means that we have to then talk about the cult of action, because mythology is based on heroes. And what do heroes do? They take action. This is one of the like defining characteristics that you'll see a lot of intellectuals talk about in relation to fascism, and really nothing else. This is something that's very unique to fascist thought. This is action for action's sake. This is violence, speed, momentum, getting things done. The idea here is that we need someone who will finally just do what needs to be done and do away with the baggage of thinking. This is heroic thinking, right? The hero doesn't have to ponder the like innate humanity of some beast before he slays it. He just slays it. Everyone has heroic thoughts at times. You know, I think like everybody thinks at some point that like, damn it, I would just do it better myself because I just like do this and get shit done. But like nobody internalizes it, and very few people make a politic out of it, and that's inherently dangerous. And of course, like democracy, this is a little bit repetitive at this point, but it should be clear that democracy is directly opposed to this idea of being a hero, because democracy is corrupt to them because it never gets anything done. And you know, nothing happens, and it's corrupt, and it's influenced by too many people. You know, when you have a multicultural democracy especially, it's very easy to get nationalists who are hooked on action to really rile against it, because then it's not only corrupt, but it's corrupt for all these different reasons who just happen to be people, which is a problem. And this is a misquote of Hermann Goering that sort of typifies that, where he says, or said, he's dead, thank God, when I see an intellectual, I reach for my pistol. Fascists don't necessarily care for intellectualism, even though there were a lot of intellectual fascists. And part of the appeal of fascism to intellectuals was that it was different and it was new, and to the like highbrow world of the academic life in like that time, it was really hidebound. And so having something to rail against is really useful, and having something to rail against that isn't using class or communism to do it is especially useful if you're not inclined to that. This all sort of begs the question of how can you have a society of heroes? And the answer is that you really can't. Of course you can't. But in terms of like mobilizing people and getting a mass movement going, it's incredibly helpful to be able to tell everybody that they're a hero. When everybody's a hero, then everybody will feel empowered, right? It's just sort of how that goes. Sidebar, it's part of the reason why I actually vehemently dislike calling anybody that volunteers for the military a hero. Anyway, but heroes need someone to fight, right? At the end of the day, you're not a hero if you're not doing something. And you're not doing something if you're not fighting something. The nation needs enemies. And the enemies are conspiracy, the dual weakness and strength of outgroups, and society itself. These are, again, all sort of globbed together because that's how fascism works. It's not something that's easily write-downable because it's intentionally not so, and it doesn't care to be either. When you care about action, you don't care about having a firm foundation of your political thought. We already touched a little bit on conspiracy, but conspiracy is really hard to understate on how vital it is to not only mobilize people as like a political tool, but also as a foundational thought of fascism. In order for the nation to have any sort of political impetus or any sort of need to defend the nation, there has to be a conspiracy against it. It has to be under threat. The ultimate irony that most logical people understand about fascist thought then is that how can you have a nation that's comprised of heroes that is all powerful and has a will to dominate others when it's so completely under threat and under threat of not just like being repressed, but under threat of being extinct, right? This is both the dual weakness and strength of outgroups. This is like one of the most researched things about Nazi ideology specifically, but fascism in general, is that, you look at the way the Nazis treated Jews and they're both the weakest people on the planet and therefore easy to oppress, and the strongest people on the planet ready to destroy the nation, right? So you have the idea that like Jews are rats and they just need to be exterminated. And then you also have the view that, Jews are omnipotent and rule everything. You and I might say that that's inherently contradictory, but like we said, fascism is syncretic. It doesn't matter that it's contradictory. And in fact, in this case, it's helpful that it is. Because if your enemies can be both, then you can throw off any shackles of society to engage them, right? We're sort of, I want to pause here for a second just to talk about outgroups, because we're kind of, because Nazism was so horrible and because Nazism was so effective, we are kind of innately biased to make this all about Jews. And I want to stress that that's not the case. Anybody can be an outgroup in this situation. And we just need to be very aware of that. Like, for us living our lives as political beings, like being aware of the language that both strengthens and delegitimizes people is so important. Because fascism happens differently everywhere. It's part of the problem with studying it. All this leads us to say that society itself at some point is the enemy of fascism, despite the fact that, of course, they purport to try to save it. It's just that they have a very specific mythic definition of what society is. And it's not made of cosmopolitans, it's not made of Jews, it's not made of homosexuals, obviously, because women need to pump out babies and you can't have gay men or lesbians or anybody else in it. And it means that democracy doesn't work, and that all of our liberal traditions that have gone back for 1,500 years don't matter. So yeah. So let's talk about that capitalist critique. The thing that most people will try to bring up when they say that like fascism isn't the right, but it is in fact the left. There is a capitalist critique in fascism, and I think that we need to understand that because it actually makes it more potent. And I think we're actually lucky that nobody on the right in this country has actually figured this out, apparently. We're so like absolutely fixated on capitalism as a society that the fascists in this country haven't figured out that they could use this potentially. So Mussolini was a socialist, that is impossible to deny. The war radicalized him though, where he saw that people weren't doing enough to fight for the Italian nation. So this means that fascism wasn't socialist because he'd moved beyond socialism by the time that he invented fascism. So the critique that comes up here is that the wealth of capitalism is good, but the wealth of capitalism is degenerate. And I don't mean that in like a degenerate art kind of way. I mean that in it atrophies the person that has it kind of way. So to them, the bourgeoisie are flabby and they don't contribute enough to the nation. They have the resources to do it, but because they're so fixated on capital and the acquisition thereof, they don't care about the nation enough. At the most basic rate, this is basically just like those damn capitalists are too busy caring about money and not busy enough being vehement racists. So that's kind of like the most boilerplate way you could say it, really. So that means that actually early fascists and fascist thinkers especially had a hard time figuring out where they actually fell on the left to right spectrum. And that's why they came up with the idea of the third way. You actually see this online quite a bit when people are talking about the need for something different. Now, third way could be like, oh, I'm a green progressive, or like, I want coalition government instead of two-party systems or something like that. But when you see people on the right say that they want a third way, they're talking about fascism. Because a third way for a fascist is like, yeah, maybe we don't have any bourgeoisie because everybody's been subsumed by the nation. Hooray! So now that we're like almost at the time where I thought this was going to end and we're not even done. Shit. So something that might be obvious now is that fascists are both reacting to and working within the liberal democratic tradition. None of this fascist thought could exist without the liberal tradition to back it up. That means that actually fascism is the most original political thought that we have in the Western tradition, and also it's the most recent. I think that's something that is hard to kind of grapple with because you'd like to think that society has advanced beyond it. We haven't had any new political traditions spring up since fascism came along. It's still the most recent thing, which is actually scary, which means it still has momentum because nothing has supplanted it yet. Hooray. TLDR, fascism uses our political and philosophical traditions to destroy them. And I hate that. I hate hypocrisy and I hate using stuff against itself, but that means it's basically political jiu-jitsu, which is fun. So violence, how do they actually come to power? Violence, people might say, is like the defining feature of fascism. I don't think it is. I think everything that came before is pretty defining, but this is also very important. Fascists love street violence, not because it'll actually bring them to power, but because it helps pave the way. It does a few different things. So it allows them to exercise their will and do action. This is helpful for like the brown shirt, you know, Proud Boy type who just wants to punch people. Go for it, street violence. But in doing this, it also shows the weakness of the established order and democracy. So when people are fighting in the streets, you can easily delegitimize everything about society, right? Because society is meant to keep order and make sure that people aren't getting beat up in the streets. Hooray. This also allows them to easily project violence onto the left, because if you're fighting, that means it's a reciprocal relationship. And the people that come out to fight Nazis are always leftists, because conservatives don't do it, and neither do centrists. And because fascists hate the left almost more than anything else, they're naturally prone to fight each other. And in doing so, the fascists can easily turn around and say, look at those, you know, damn communists, they're fighting back. We should do something about them. And this also has a dual utility of not just showing that there's a problem, but showing that fascists can do something about it. When fascists say, hey, we're fighting them for you, establishment powers, isn't that useful? There's a lot of power to be had in that dialogue, in that relationship. But violence, you know, like I said, isn't actually the way to power for the fascists. It's a tool to leverage public opinion and signal to elites that they are here to stay and that they have something to offer. It opens a door to more traditional means of gaining power. But Will, you might say, what about like Mussolini's famous march on Rome? Like no fighting happened there. Mussolini actually stepped off the train and like talked to the king and he was like, I've just come from the battlefield. He hadn't. He was in Milan and was like reading in a train car for the entire day. And then decided to show up and was like, I'm going to pretend I fought. He didn't. The thing that is defining here, though, is that both Hitler and Mussolini were actually welcomed into political power in collaboration with conservative established politicians. In Mussolini's case, it's the king who just was like, hey, your dudes are just sort of outside. We're going to let you be this official position. It's not necessarily the most democratic way to go about it, but he was co-opting Mussolini and Mussolini was co-opting the king. The same with Hitler. Hitler didn't march and like try to have a revolution. He did try in the beer hall butch and didn't work. And so that made him learn that he had to do politics actually to get into power. And he weaseled his way in there. And actually, it wasn't that he got a majority, he just got a plurality. And then the conservatives have to say, we either give Hitler traditional political powers or we hand it over to the left. And conservatives being conservatives, they gave it to the fascists because they'd rather have a fascist in power who they think they can control than a communist. So the myth of the seizure of power is pretty big in fascist mythology or self-mythologizing, but something to be concerned about is that they're not going to throw a coup. And if they're going to try, it's not going to work probably. And it'll just make them learn that they have to actually take things a little bit more seriously in the traditional political realm. Classes and masses. So how do you actually appeal to people who vote for you then? Some, like the totalitarian worldview thinks that World War I demolished all class structures and replaced everybody with like aimless masses. I don't agree with that. But there is something to be said that without political identity and adrift in a deeply psychologically damaging and economically bereft post-war world, people became part of sort of a faceless blob. You might have a class, but psychologically you might not anymore, which is, I know, sounds like complete trash because we're talking psychology, and I admit that. But I think there is something to be said for the masses idea here of how people fit into politics, especially in democracy. So the only political power, though, that could actually appeal to any of these people who are that bereft is fascism, because the traditional isms were so deeply entrenched by being logical and being establishment that they didn't have anything to offer anymore. That said, when you look at class, though, like class still existed and it still exists today. And it's worth noting that in terms of the people that this sort of fascist worldview appeals to, it's not the lower class, it's not the proletariat folks like socialism is, because those people don't have anything to lose. That's why they're communists, that's why they're socialists. And it's not the upper classes either, because those are like the elite capitalists, you know, the conservative establishment and everything. Those people are inherently conservative. And if they're going to appeal to any sort of dictatorship, it's authoritarian, because authoritarian is from the top down. Fascism makes its fundamental claim from the bottom up. So that means that fascism's appeal was largely to the lower middle class. And fascism, and Nazism in specific, has been called a party of shopkeepers, which I think is very interesting. So in other words, fascism is a political ideology for those with the most to lose, who are overwhelmed by the unpredictable chaos of the modern lived experience. They're economically and politically unsafe, and they're angry as a result. You might notice that almost none of these things that we're mentioning here, except for maybe the economics part, almost none of these are actually empirical, right? These are all emotional situations that people find themselves in. Yeah. These are people that are afraid of being poor, but will never realize being rich. And therefore they have to tread water and they will hold on to any lifeline. So I already mentioned this a lot, so this will probably be a short slide, thank God. But we're talking about co-opting conservatives, hooray. When we're talking about elites, we can probably say elites instead of conservatives, excuse me. But capitalism makes all elites fundamentally conservative. Maybe not socially, but politically, yes. It's also a myth that fascist parties, you see this with the Nazis a lot, people will say that they're funded entirely by business, and so they're like a party funded and made by businessmen. This fundamentally isn't true if you look into it at all. Businesses did fund fascists in whatever society they were in, but they were also funding everybody else. It's only really once the fascists get momentum, they start winning electorally, they maybe get into power in some way, shape, or form, that real money starts rolling their way. Because when the center disappears and traditional conservatives aren't around as much anymore, you either have people voting for the fascists or the communists, and the elites will always vote with the fascists then. Yeah, but at the same time, fascists have to indicate their utility, and that utility can either be practical, where the fascists will tell them what they're going to do for them, which happens a lot. The fascist idea of being uncorrupt very quickly falls apart once it comes into trying to gain power, right? But it can also be that more psychological usefulness of seen as a bulwark against the left. So basically everyone thinks they're using each other, and isn't that fun? Isn't that a great way to immediately lose all political power and all democratic processes once the fascist gets their toes in the door? Because that is entirely how it always seems to work. How fun. So now that the fascist is actually in power, let's talk about radicalizing fascism. This is the last section, so we're not going to go that over time. But this is also the one where people get killed more. People get killed in street violence all the time, but like this is where lots of people get killed. So we do have to talk a little bit about like everything we said with the fascist ideology and fascist promises. Do they actually happen? Not really. And that's one of the interesting things about fascism is that once they're in power, the things that they do often fundamentally contradict the like worldview that they supposedly have. But then again, they can easily hand wave that away, as we've seen with the syncretic version of thinking about politics. And this is part of the reason why you can't take fascist intellectuals completely seriously, and you also can't take their rhetoric absolutely at face value. And so we do actually have to look a little bit at what they did. And largely what they did was honestly just gear up for war in the historical situation, but oftentimes it was more co-opting the we might say the means of production, but like big business and stuff to organize them for the nation. And what the nation needs is often just defined by the fascists. So like in the Nazi case, it was we're going to harness everything in the state to try to rearm and go to war. In Mussolini's case, it's a little bit more amorphous, but like nobody really knows what Mussolini was going for because he was bad at his job fundamentally. But anyway, I'm rambling now. So, but long story short, this is a function of them needing to actually compromise to some degree with conservative elites because you can't just like get into politics and just start doing whatever you want, especially when you haven't earned it completely by yourself. And when you haven't, thrown a coup and overthrown the government, and when you haven't straight up won democratically entirely, you're still beholden a little bit to the people, the power brokers that got you into power. So the conservative elites in this case aren't out of the picture. They're very much behind the scenes. The apologists will say modulating fascist policy, but we all know that's not really true and it doesn't hold up very well, right? So they might be there, but they're grifting like everybody else. But that being said, they'll almost always succeed in making governments less democratic because that's partially fundamentally what they're there to do. And so you'll see all sorts of bills happen in Italy and in Nazi Germany that ban presses, ban political parties, and consolidate power into the hands of the fascist. So a more radicalized fascist state might not carry out specifics in terms of policy, but rather the general national will. This is often typified by the dictator, but power diffuses, right? So at some point, you can't just blame everything on the dictator and people have to take responsibility for their own thing, in which case they have to think about what the national will is, which is hard to define, but it's almost always killing people. At the same time, though, the completion of fascist policy platforms might not even matter in terms of popularity or power. And when I was thinking about this, the build the wall thing came up. This is really the only modern like analogy that I'll make. Um, is that the build the wall thing is a slogan, right? Its policy is slogan more than anything else. And when the wall doesn't get built, it fundamentally doesn't matter because just expressing that and running on that is what matters. The message, the medium is the message, and the message is the medium. Also, like a wall is passive, right? So for a fascist, why would you want a passive response to what you see as a problem? Why not put children in cages and give them forced hysterectomies instead? That's an active policy. And that's much more appealing to a fascist because it's not only like getting to the quote unquote root of the problem, but it's also something where you're actively doing something. It's not deterrence. They don't care about deterrence. They care about violence. I should also say that the radicalized state is sort of the theme here, fascist radicalization. This is more just like what fascism does once it starts to get into power because it has the ability to do what it wants, even with some constraints. So that's why it radicalizes. Even when it's trying to become a political party that gets power, you have to play some cards close to the chest, right? So this is the state versus the prerogative state is an idea that Paxton comes up with in his book. And the state is like the government that they take over, right? The civil services, the bureaucracies, the welfare state, and so on and so forth. But the prerogative state, in his view, is the parallel party apparatus that fascists almost always make to compensate and compete with the traditional state organ that they're working in. So this is something like the SA and the SS taking over traditional policing work, and the Gestapo being those organizations being completely legitimately separate from the like standard police and military of the Third Reich. So those are always competing with each other. But because the prerogative state has prerogatives like state of being privileged, is privileged by being part of the party, they can do whatever they want. And so once you get in power, you have this natural competition that happens between party organizations and the state itself. This is a tactic to gain power because like creating parallel organizations like a community police network, women's organizations, like you mentioned, children's organizations like the Hitler Youth and stuff like that are ways to drum up popular support. But once you're in power, these work to radicalize the state more and to drag the rest of the government where you want it to go as a fascist. Because when you have people like the Gestapo rounding up people, I mean, in accordance to what they think the laws are, then the basic, like, the democratic state such as it still exists has to follow along. Part of the reason why, like, the militias and border patrol people that just kind of do what they want are really concerning, because that is sort of an idea of a prerogative parallel organization. It's worth noting that in this regard, that fascism becomes deeply inefficient. The idea that fascism is like the trains run on time and like German efficiency and stuff like that falls apart the second you actually look at what Nazism and fascism did in power, which is that they're all competing with each other. All these people are competing with each other. None of them are working together towards the same goal because everybody has their own competing parallel organizations. It's only when you get to people like Heinrich Himmler, who have a ton of organizations underneath them, that you really start to get any sort of like forward momentum on a lot of things. It's really weird. And Paxton sees the prerogative state run wild in the Eastern Front. So historically, like, Germany invades Poland and Russia and gets a huge swath of territory and massive amounts of people under its control. And now suddenly the prerogative state swoops in, where you can sort of think about it this way. The traditional state is like the Wehrmacht fighting at the front, and then the prerogative state are like the Einsatzgruppen and the SS sweeping in behind them and killing everyone behind them. Where the authority levels don't line up easily, or evenly. And so people can kind of just do what they want. And because they have this vague idea of what the national will is, they can just exercise it as they please. I know that that's kind of vague, but like, you can think just about parallel organizations. Wow. And so when all this is going on, how do you actually keep people engaged politically with your party? How do you keep radicalizing the masses or classes, depending, to do stuff? Well, we can look to Walter Benjamin for this with the aestheticization of politics. This is something that is definitional in a lot of ways to fascism. We talked a lot about art and culture previously. This is where it reaches its apotheosis. He wrote in 1935, so before like the wars even kicked off, fascism attempts to organize the newly proletarianized masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while preserving property. The logical result of fascism is the introduction of aesthetics into political life. Mankind, which in Homer's time was a spectacle for the Olympian gods, has become one for itself. Communism responds by politicizing art. So let's unpack that just a little bit. This is the second to last slide. Thank God for you people. Thanks for bearing along here. But the idea here is that politics, because the fascist state is now deeply enrooted, really has no meaning, right? But you have to keep popular support to like fight your wars or, you know, perform your genocides or whatever. So you do that by making art into politics. And that's how you see things like, you know, the Nuremberg rally and the columns of light that they had there, and Leni Riefenstahl movies and stuff like that. When it becomes a more emotional expression to be political, there you go, you've aestheticized art. Part of the reason why Nazis had such slick uniforms is like the most basic and boring example of that. When you can make something artistic into politics, then you can keep people engaged with your program now that you're in power. I think it's very telling that Benjamin just sort of ends that coda with communism responds by politicizing art, which by being a 5-sentence or 5-word sentence after this like big paragraph sort of shows that that's a quaint way to try to combat it, and it fundamentally doesn't work. Because yeah, you can have a painting that's like a political painting, but what does that have to a mass rally? It's nothing. It's nothing. Smart guy, killed himself before the war, I think. Anyway, atomization. This is the last slide, and this is probably in a way grim, like it's always been. Atomization is the idea that as social bonds broke down after the First World War and continue to this day, that people just have to act on their own, and that opens up all sorts of interesting and weird phenomena to happen. So atomization, depending on who you ask, can either be the genesis of fascism or it can be the day-to-day practice of fascism. For Hannah Arendt, atomization is both an origin and a practice. For Paxton, it's more of a day-to-day thing, and it's a sign of a truly radicalized fascist state. So when we talk about the genesis, we can see atomization, or maybe if we're thinking more Marxist terms, the alienation of the individual results in the sublimation of the individual into the nation, which co-opts or conquers the state. So by being just a sole individual with nothing really to latch onto, the only thing that you have left in a liberal society that's let you down is the idea of the nation, because it's the most basic and, as we've seen, the most mythological and therefore immutable, right? So when you're appealing to something that's that vague but that emotional, it's a very easy way to, you know, get people riled up and have them become fascists. Once you're in a fascist state, though, that doesn't mean that you're still not atomized, right? Because fascism is fundamentally fraudulent in a lot of ways, and that includes in the way that it promises to de-atomize people. So fascism doesn't solve it, of course. You know, you're still going to be alienated and alone, but it actually furthers it. It encourages individual action based on these violent primordial truths that it keeps pushing. And the dictator embodies the truth. You know, the dictator is always the font of like national wisdom in any kind of dictatorship, but especially in fascist one. But the dictator doesn't need to actually direct anything, or it doesn't need to direct everything. The atomized individual acts based on his reference. Probably the most pertinent and poignant example is the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, which is the 90-minute conference that a bunch of senior Nazi officials had where they discussed and created the final solution. They just decided that they were going to kill everyone that they could find in the East. And there's a lot of debate about this. It's very like well researched, but there's very little direction on Hitler, for example, or anybody else like at that level in Nazi Germany actually telling these people to do this. They all come together, act of their own initiative, and disrupt the industry by deciding to kill all the Jews. Part of the reason why they do this, though, is because of the competition that we talked about between their parallel organizations. The guy who ran the like puppet government in Poland was like, why do you people keep shipping all of your German Jews into Poland? I don't want them. And the guys that were shipping the German Jews into Poland were like, well, we don't want the Jews here because we know that Hitler doesn't want them here anymore. And then they were like, can't you send them further south? And the people that are running the south were like, you can't send them over here, so let's all meet up together and decide what to do with them. And so through that weird competition that they had where nobody wanted to lose face by having too many Jews in their conquered territory, they decided extermination. And that's like a perfect example of people being atomized because they're all acting independently of each other, but furthering the same common goal. So that's like the fascist version of atomization. So in this very grim view of how individuals act under fascism, our fixation of who is actually quote unquote responsible at any level for the Holocaust is parochial, just as the fascists was wanted to be, right? It's a national movement. It doesn't matter who actually signed the orders, and nobody needed to. And they probably wouldn't have wanted anybody to have to sign the orders either, ideologically at least. For fascists, it's probably good that nobody's signature says, yes, Holocaust, check mark yes. Because it shows that there is a national will in play. That's grim. So basically, accentuated, politicized adriftness that can only be resolved by fascism is how we can think about the atomization of the individual. Yeah, so that's arguably the grimmest thing I've ever said, maybe. But I do have a closing statement, and I know I've talked a ton, but this time I actually wrote something, which is very navel-gazy, but here we go. I just have to find it, which is a nightmare. Yeah, so I want to end everything a little bit on a discussion about what truth means, because that's sort of been simmering under the surface for all of this, is that through the liberal tradition and everything, we have to wonder if the fascist actually cares about truth at all. I don't think they do. And it's pretty clear that they don't. But I have to pull up my Google Docs so that I can talk for like 5 more minutes about it, which is bad. Okay. My written and prepared remarks, thank God. Okay. I'm gonna drink some wine first. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone about the exercise of defining fascism, such as we have, and cataloging some of its movements, I want to spend our closing moment here talking about truth and what that means. This is where we get even more vague and self-indulgent than we already have been. So I appreciate you bearing with me thus far and continuing to bear with me here. In short, which is really long, but the idea of truth as the concept is typically understood means very little to the rabid fascist. I think we understand that now. But I want to expand on why and its implications. Truth requires us to understand our present in relation to our past, either as individuals or as community. In a way, despite its claims to eternity then, truth is chronological. It's historical, or at least the way that we understand truth is. Fascist truth doesn't care about history as a source of anything. Fascist truth is mythology. Fascists dredge the immemorial for truths on nation, race, society, gender, and so on to create their fanatic ideology. Their view of mythology is static and immortal, divorced entirely from time. At the most indulgent, this makes fascist mythology or mythological truth mystical. Fascist truth is entirely ahistorical and could not care less about time or its influence on the evolution of the human experience. Liberal politics, the politics that we mostly live in, is subsumed and predicated on time. Conservative gradualism is slavishly devoted to time. Marxist dialectical materialism could not exist without the linear, forward-moving chronology of economic determinism. All these politics rely on learning from the past, making decisions that affect the present, and planning, or hoping, for the future. In my mind, fascism is the only political ideology that is bereft of time. It seeks to displace historical time with the eternal darkness of fascist mythological truth. Hitler's claim that he was building a 1,000-year Reich is, in a way, quaint when looking at the fascist fixation on mythology. The Nazis, like all fascists, were simply trying to fix the political now, but they were also trying to realize the mythological truths of their race, nation, and culture. The mythological past of the nation may be temporal, linear, even historical, but mythology as truth has the eternal and ever-present claim to all time. The ultimate success of fascism then, which thankfully has never been realized and in this formulation seems almost impossible, would not only result in discarding historical truth as the basis for politics, but the obliteration of linear time as the foundation for all social, economic, political, and individual being. Thanks. Any questions on that one? That's it. Just unmute yourself. I'm not going to call on you. That would be insane. Okay, well, now somebody's got to say something.
Okay.
Thank you, Spencer, for the claps.
Okay, so
Andrew, yes, hello.
Will, spectacular conversation or spectacular talk.
Yeah, well, it's not a conversation.
No, you made this a very romantic evening for Anna and I. We appreciate that. So I have a lot to say actually, but I think I might write you an email later. But right now I have 2 comments and a question that I'd like to pose to you.
Go.
Comment is that I think if you want to continue expanding and delving deeper into this presentation, I'm curious if there's a place for you to talk about dissent within fascist movement. You know, because obviously like Nazi purges of like brown shirt organizations are well known, but a new book has just come out about the Fiume crisis, in which Gabriella D'Annunzio led a shit ton of World War I veterans into what is now Rijeka, Croatia, to claim it for Italy from Yugoslavia, and it left everybody at the Treaty of Versailles talks in Paris like kind of at a standstill as how to handle it. But D'Annunzio and Mussolini hated each other's guts.
They did.
They're both the leading fascists of
Yeah.
the time in Italy. The second comment is that I'm wondering, especially when I hear Paxton's definition of fascism, is there a discerning to be made between wartime and peacetime fascism? Because I feel like his definition doesn't meet Iberian fascism, that is the regimes in Spain and Portugal, which did not participate in World War II, were not like focused on annexation of geographical regions. You know, that's a question that I had.
No.
Or a comment, I should say. And then finally, my question that I'll actually pose is that I want to know if you have thoughts on, since you've reviewed the literature quite masterfully, I'll say, is our understanding of fascism as a political movement inherently Eurocentric? In that when we look at like post-colonial authoritarian movements around the developing world that also had cults of personality, ideologically inconsistent and yet very much violently backed ideologies of conservatism and things like that. Juan Perón in Argentina, maybe even the Shah in Iran, Gaddafi, whatever you want to say. I'm wondering if that's a thought that, if you think that there's any kind of justification to that argument.
First of all, thanks for all those thoughts. Your PhD working sure does show there, Andrew. That was more cogent than pretty much anything I said. Good call about the dissension, especially in competing fascists. D'Annunzio, famous proto-fascist, if we're being generous, straight up fascist, if we're being accurate. Really flamboyant. He's like a fascinating guy. He's a piece of shit, but yeah, his relationship with Mussolini fractured. I don't really have much to say about it because the Fiume crisis is really interesting. Maybe just struck too soon and wasn't actually in the heart of Italy. I don't know. Yeah, this is a restrictive definition. You're not wrong. It's very sort of predicated on wartime stuff, and you're right. He actually does explicitly exclude Salazar in Portugal and Franco in Spain as not being fascists, which is not something I necessarily agree or disagree with because I don't know about either of them well enough. I think part of his thing with Portugal specifically is that it's like a very bureaucratic fascism, as it was called, and it didn't really, it was much more of a top-down sort of organization, and it had very little popular like mass support. And Franco, to his mind, actually is the conservative elite that co-opts the fascists in a way successfully. When the fascist leader of the Phalangists dies, Franco steps in and basically de-radicalizes, in some ways, to Paxton's mind, the Phalangists. I don't know if I buy that necessarily. You know, 200,000 people are still like executed and murdered under Franco's regime after the Civil War ends. But yeah, you're right that this is a really restrictive definition. And so I think we can take and leave certain parts of it and allow for more breathing room. As far as this being a really Eurocentric view of what fascism is, I agree. And I think that's partially because we've been lucky enough not to experience that many fascist movements. I hate to say it's like a bias of us not having enough fascists to compare against each other, because that is insane because it's wishing more fascists into the world. But for Paxton, at least, and I kind of buy this a little bit, is that the momentum for fascist movements is innately from the bottom, or at least that's what they say. Whereas he explicitly views like post-colonial South America specifically are great examples of like top-down, just classic conservative authoritarianism. There's nothing to be overthrown by those regimes, whereas a fascist regime inherently sees itself as revolutionary and to try to overthrow the status quo. Part of the reason why there's a critique of capitalism in fascism and why it actually has occasionally drawn people from the left who get disenfranchised with the left into the far right is because there's still a revolutionary critique there. I think you say like people like Perón are just conservative autocrats who want to maintain the status quo to pilfer the state rather than being, you know, revolutionaries in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, it's a great point though. Like it's something that seems at this point to be a uniquely European, and if we're being even more restrictive, probably problematically so, Western European phenomenon. Which means that it is part of the American tradition too.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Wow.
Hey,
Thanks,
Will,
Hannah, for bearing with us.
I have a question, Will.
Go, Alan.
So based on your definition, and or maybe Paxton's definition, or both, I'm just curious, who are the, in your opinion, I guess, like, who are the like modern or the popular modern fascists? Like, where do we see this still being like carried out and enacted, and where do you see it like maybe becoming more popular in the near future?
That's a great question. I mean, the alt-right is fascist. Jordan Peterson's a fascist. Ted Cruz is fasci. Part of the problem with this question, and this is something that I had a hard time like articulating to myself, so I didn't try to do it like in a slide, is that time moves on and we've learned a lot of lessons from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And by that, I mean that popular democracies and nations like ours have taken a fair amount of these tactics and lessons and worldview to heart. Because once you have a conflagration like World War II, you can't like unlearn all those things. So when we're talking about like in groups and out groups and stuff like that, we can see that very clearly in play with a lot of our counterterrorism policies and international like policy. That shouldn't be surprising because there's always that like fear-mongering international relations, but especially so. So I think it's a hard question to answer because I think that generally speaking, democracies have become more fascistic since they were before the war. And so a lot of the like genuinely revolutionary things that we can see happening in fascist movements in relation to how they work in society just exist as norms now. And I think that's actually fundamentally terrifying. But I think that's part of the reason why I'm having a hard time like cogently pointing out specific things and specific people is because we're kind of still in a milieu of fascism. Because like I said in the talk, like fascism, in my mind at least, is still the most recent political innovation that we've come across.
I have a question. Would an example be Saddam Hussein taking advantage of the perpetual conflict between Sunni and Shia Muslims to like consolidate his power?
God, makes me wish I knew more about Saddam, which is quite the sentence to say. It's a quick sidebar. Addressing Saddam for a second. There's apparently a smoke shop at the base of my street now, and I was walking by it, and they had this massive hookah. In the middle of the hookah was carved into a golden AK-47, and it just made me think of Saddam, and I was like, ha! And I laughed out loud on the street, which is the first time I've done that in a long time. But yeah, something that's interesting about Saddam, and I think that you can draw at least a few parallels here. I didn't talk about religion that much in this talk, but see, it was the Ba'athist, right, with Saddam, inherently like a religious party and more of a pan-Arab tradition. So yeah, in a way, he used a lot of popular resentment on both of those religious groups to play against each other because he saw himself above both. Yeah, it's definitely, I think it's fascistic. I don't know if I would say Saddam was a fascist, but I don't know enough about his coming to power, honestly. And the post-colonial like situation there always complicates things too, which I know is like such a cop-out sentence. But yeah, sure. Yes, I would need to look into it more.
Well, I'm not sorry. I am co-opting the question, but I wanted to ask to bring up that example to think that like we understand fascism in terms of American democratic identity, and so like I just wanted to bring up the topic of like, does American identity require some kind of foil of some other figure who displays fascist tendencies.
Yeah, I kind of want to even take that thought into a slightly different direction, which is to say, like, do you have to be a democracy to be fascist? And how deep in the like democratic and liberal tradition do you need to be a fascist? Like, could we have a fascist that operates in a place that hardly has a democratic tradition and just was reacting to international democracy? I think if we sort of reframe it a little bit that way, I think somebody like Saddam, or honestly anybody that's ruled Iran in the modern world, could slot in there. Yeah, I don't know. You got me, Greg.
I forgot what my third question was.
Okay.
Hi, Will.
Hello,
I have a question
Ann.
for you.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you if you think that modern day fascism is a half-baked iteration or a new
do.
wave, and what the aesthetic would be of it, seeing that I can't think of a modern day Wagner for American fascism. And do you think that the absence of maybe fine art attached to the movement makes it more accessible to the shopkeepers or alt-right incels in America?
Yeah, no, that's a good. That's all good. That's great. Yeah, I do think that compared to like the robustness of fascism in the European setting, American fascism is really pretty bad. And I mean, it's all fascism is bad, but I mean that like in terms of how it works and how it's organized and stuff like it. We are lucky that our fascists are incompetent, and they can't organize. They fight amongst themselves, which is perfect. Yeah, but in terms of like centralized figures, you're right that we don't really have any. And I think that since like 2015 or so, we've seen the rise and fall of so many figures in the alt-right that it's hard for them to latch onto anybody at all. And I think part of the reason is that it's very hard to find people in our society who have been big figures culturally, that have like readily embraced or converted or have really been espousing a lot of like straight up fascist thought. One of the things about Wagner is that even though he was sort of a high art figure, he was still like one of the prides of Germany. Like I think that if you went back and asked like a lot of turn of the century Germans if they knew who Wagner was, they'd say, of course, right? So even though they might not have ever seen an opera, they might still know of him and hold him in national esteem, kind of thing. And I think that we're sort of fortunate that we haven't had that. But in terms of like separating fascism from art, I think that you're right in that we've moved past that in some ways. But I think that if we started to see more fascistic art, we'd probably see a more empowered right. And I think that that's part of the reason why I'm always concerned about like those religious like movies where it's like God's not dead and stuff like that, is because that's sort of like a really flaccid gesturing towards artistic fascism that is, again, I think we're sort of lucky just by its incompetence. And so in some ways, like the decentralization of art in society that we have now disempowers fascism, like in the way that we've defined it here. But I think it wouldn't be that hard to get things back. I think it, and the way that art is made now is so like sort of from the bottom up that I think it might even ascribe more closely to fascist thought than like high art becoming fascistic like it did in the turn of the century. But that's also me just completely shooting from the hip and probably being irresponsible.
Will, I have two questions, and the second question is contingent on the first.
Of course.
We're roasting you from Connecticut.
Right. The first question is, am I allowed to ask you about Trump?
And it's the second question, something specific about him?
It can be. If you say no, I have another question in backup.
Jesus Christ. Sure, Andrew, go for it. It's not like I've intentionally like tried to not follow him too much because it would make me too sad. So,
Okay, it's a general question. So I wanted to ask, in your opinion, are we as American liberals, did we flatter ourselves during the Trump administration by trying to compare him to 20th century European fascists?
Yes.
When to me, in my experience, I'm just going to throw this out there, in Latin American studies, he seems much more like a caudillo, a man on horseback, this political outsider who rides in, is intentionally awkward and grating to the establishment, but because he represents the common people because of that. In other words, is he really just a new world democratic phenomenon? Or is he actually some sort of Mussolini / Hitler incarnate, as say the New York Times or Washington Post have tried so hard to make him out to be?
Yeah. I think that your comparison with like maybe thinking about Trump as an American phenomenon, like continental America phenomenon, is like a really interesting one. I think that's an interesting way that we could frame that. And I think I definitely see the point of your read too. I think fundamentally that part of the hard time that we have with trying to find what Trump is / was is that unlike someone like Hitler who was a gambler and knew how to gamble and could do it really well, and unlike Mussolini who worked really hard and was very present and tried to like be clear in his aims and how he was riling up people, Trump is bad at all those things. He's not a good gambler. He seems to be of such little mental strength that the idea of him actually being successful in anything political is mind-boggling. And as we've seen, like when he was in power, he didn't do that much. Like despite all the hand-wringing that we do, it was almost always like more social rather than policy. And the policy that we got was pushed through Congress, so it wasn't all him. And a lot of it was like executive orders that are easily rescinded, right? So in terms of the harm's still there, of course, but in terms of the competence, I think it's low. And so that makes it really hard to define exactly what Trump is. And so I think that the way that we've been defining him as like, I'm trying to think of anything that I read online that was like play on words with his name or like how he looked with like Mussolini and stuff like that. And there's something to be said for it, but I think that we are kind of flattering ourselves a little bit because the second we get anybody more competent, it'll look quaint. That being said, though, you look at Steve Bannon, you look at Gorka and all those other scumbags, straight up fascists, some of them straight up Nazis. So the company you keep definitely reflects on you there. And so I think in terms of how those men directed policy, we can definitely say it was fascistic. In terms of Trump himself as a fascist, it's almost colloquial to me, or not colloquial, parochial to me.
Okay, I have one more question, then I'll shut the fuck up, and anybody can ask whatever they want. Okay. So I'm going to ask the question first, and then I'm going to explain my thought process behind it afterwards. So I want to ask you, is the dissemination, wow, I saw you down that. You're ready for this. You're ready for me, okay. So is the dissemination of military culture a prerequisite for the rise of fascism? And I ask that because obviously any AP Euro textbook says that the influx of World War I veterans into the European body politic obviously led to a rise of like, the Spartan movements and whatnot, like all the extremist movements and whatnot. And then since the January 6th storming of the US Capitol, the number of veterans that took part has also been notable. Now, so right now in the US, we're fixated on extremism in the ranks of the military at the moment. And all current and former like military leaders in the US are insistent that service people are radicalized after they leave the service as veterans. But here's the thing. So like World War I, and then even if you look at the Roman Republic at the end of the Punic Wars, these were these mass mobilization, generation defining conflicts, which we have not had in the 21st century, but we have been in low grade conflict for over a decade and have a substantial body of veterans in our population as a result. And so I think basically we've had this sleeping growth, this like under the radar growth of radicalizable, disaffected veterans in our population. And I'm wondering if you feel that like we've reached a point like similar to a post-World War I environment in which we have, you know, society and economy that's not serving our veterans. And then I'm also just asking for the sake of, does the military model of like authority, like acting in action, taking decisive movements towards a goal, is that all important for feeding into the growth of a fascist movement in society?
Yeah, those are all great points. And now that you mentioned militarization, it's shocking that I forgot to mention it at all, really, because it was so foundational. Um, Yeah, I think your point about having a growing number of sort of like underground, disaffected, disenfranchised veterans is a good call, because I do think that we really mistreat our veterans, and we always have. Um, I think the militarized nature of social like discourse is something that we've actually, that I think that's one of those items that we've sort of taken to heart since the 40s and has sort of become baked into our society. So I don't know if it's like a unique phenomenon at this point anymore to be like, ooh, hooray, thank you for your service, you know, like that sort of stuff is just sort of part of American culture at this point. And I think it's because we do have such a massive military. Um, But I think you're right that there is a difference to be made between the sort of continual, low level, relatively small body count, and relatively small deployment sizes that we've had versus like the mass mobilization and carnage that you saw on the Western Front and also in World War II. Because I do think that if militarization is going to become a big factor, because I think it is like a really useful tool to radicalize people and to gain political momentum once you have it. But I think in order to have it, you do have to have sort of a mass claim to like society. Uh, Society owes veterans, and like we all know, society owes veterans. But what I mean by that is like society owes veterans in a fundamental and existential way. And I think that that's part of what like Mussolini and Hitler were both able to log into as veterans themselves. Um, to say, hey, we have a literal mass of people, the people that are the backbone of society, that are agitating in this way. And I think where you get something that's unique in the 20s and 30s is that they could actually rightly claim that it was the backbone of society. Whereas like now you have people say that the military are like the best of us and like they're heroes and they're the backbone of society, but it's all like sort of high level sociological stuff rather than like a political fact that like, yeah, in 1920, most adult males in all of the Western world were veterans or active soldiers. Like that's just a fact. And I think that the danger that we have with our current conflicts isn't so much that we have a rising body of like disaffected veterans who are sort of like, I guess, sleeper agents or something like that. That's probably unfair because I still think that there aren't that many of them. But I think where we get to the problem is that these are becoming multi-generational conflicts. So you've seen like news reports over the past couple of years of people being like, a father who first served in Iraq is now sending, like in Desert Storm, is now sending his son to do 3 tours in Afghanistan or something like that. And you're like, oh shit, we're like just in a constant state of war and it's affecting families. And I think that's where we might get a little bit more of an issue, because now you can get a mass mobilization that is multi-generational rather than like one fixed generation of like World War I veterans. Because then you can radicalize society in all age brackets. And, you know, as you get older, you get more conservative anyway. But like, yeah, it's much easier to be a radical when your father or your mother is also a veteran and is also radical because they went through the same thing. I don't know. That's my vague bullshit on that. I don't know if that tracks at all.
It's good vague bullshit. I like it.
Also, I realize that we're just still talking, but if you're like completely out of your mind, feel free to just leave. You don't have to like be trapped here if you don't want to be, unless you just like the discourse. In which case, enjoy the discourse. But
Will,
Spencer,
great job.
Great job.
thanks, Molly.
Long time listener, first time caller. I guess what I'm curious about this too, and I am drinking a bottle and a half of wine during this, is what are the key indicators that divide fascism between possibly post-war Soviet era and current China, with certain tendencies, especially with Xi taking over, trying to go for the Spratly Islands, all the Belt and Road, and then with kind of the issue in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs.
Yeah. About communism generally. Communism is an old political ideology. We think it's like recent, but it goes back to like the 1840s, 1830s really. Like in 1848, when there were revolutions, there were people who were like socialists. So like it's old. And the thing that is important to note there, at least in comparison to fascism, is that communism and socialism theoretically have to be internally consistent. Doesn't mean that they are in practice. Like Stalinism, everybody agrees that Stalinism is something completely different to what like the Soviet system is, right? But even Stalin, at his most bloodthirsty, his most paranoid, his most radical, was still writing texts to the Politburo and the rest of the party, trying to rationalize his understanding in the tenets of socialism. So I think when we think about fascism and communism relationship to each other, that's an important thing, because fascists don't care about that. They don't care about the leader making a political treatise to justify his killing of people in the name of international communism. In a way, it's kind of hilarious that Stalin had to do that, but the fact that he did it all means that politically and ideologically, these are separate instances and separate ideas. Where people like to draw comparisons between the Soviet system and fascism is, of course, in the totalitarian model, which again, I don't think is very useful, because eventually you just sort of start to define totalitarianism as what Hitler and Stalin did, and therefore what Hitler and Stalin did is totalitarian. And it's a way to just draw equivalencies between Hitler and Stalin, which you can, like they're both bloodthirsty monsters. But I don't think that means that they are fundamentally the same thing. At least not like politically in the way that they organized, mobilized, and manipulate people. In relation to China, TBD on that. I think that as China sort of decommunizes itself and becomes whatever China is now and seems to be doing, we could sort of easily see it becoming fascistic. But right now, I don't really know. I don't think anybody has quite enough visibility into the higher workings of China as a country to say too clearly. Definitely horrible, definitely deplorable and condemnable, definitely expansionist and nationalist. But I don't think their claims to making any sort of mass revolution to overthrow the existing order is ever going to come in, right? Like at this point, the People's Party of China is pretty solidly in place, and they're not going to uproot their own order to try to galvanize people. They're kind of beyond that at this point. Yeah, I guess maybe the Great Leap Forward was the last time that, like, yeah, Great Leap Forward was actually kind of fascistic now that I think about it. But I don't know nearly enough about China to like talk too much about Mao. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. China's always been a unique case, pretty much all the time. Thanks, Max. Bye, Max. So that's my inadequate answer to your actually very good question.
Thank you, Will.
You're
Great
welcome,
job.
Spencer and Molly.
Okay, Will, I'm so sorry, but I actually have another question.
Christ, Andrew. Okay, go.
Okay, I'm several drinks in at this point, so like this might be getting like really like bullshitty Michel Foucault kind of shit. But a question that occurs to me is that I want to ask, and this might be overly Nazi-centric of me to ask, but I'm wondering, are human bodies the currency of fascist movements, in that the desired bodies of the nation need to be built up and multiplied, and then the bodies of the minorities that are the enemies of the state need to be literally liquidated. They must be killed and disposed of. Whereas American conservatives are focused on what, the national debt and corporate tax write-offs, I don't see. And then even I'd say American liberals are focused on identity politics, but not quite human bodies, I feel like there's a very corporal aspect of 20th century European fascism. How do you feel about that statement?
I think that's poignant. I think that tracks. If I had to expand more, I'd say it had to do something with everybody getting killed in the First World War, and there's some body horror there, and so there must be some connection there. Thanks, Aubrey. Bye, Aubrey. Also, I'm assuming Mookie, you're out too, if she is, but yeah. Yeah, I think that is something you could write an article about, Andrew.
I second that. I agree. I encourage you. Do it.
All right, thank you. Nevertheless, I mean, by the way, the work you've done is definitely worth writing an article to submit for popular publication in a major newspaper. I think you're up there. I would look into popularizing your works.
That's very kind.
Remove all the nuance and just send it as a tweet thread.
Yeah, fascism, a thread. Just the Zoom transcript, typos and incomprehensibility and everything.
I mean, what is modernity besides a computer recreating whatever you're saying? Truly,
you're not
just
wrong.
be lost. Yeah. I had a question for you, a couple maybe.
Yes, Megan. I mean, Andrew's taken up all the quota of grad school friend questions. So
yeah, so I gotta get the fuck out. I guess the first one is, do you have the same view of the lens of authoritarianism as the same analytically useless as totalitarianism?
Not necessarily. I think dictatorship is too big of a bucket because just about everything can be a dictatorship depending on who you ask. But authoritarianism, I think, is something that you can define pretty directly as as we said in relation to the South American model, sort of an innately conservative strongman dictatorship ruling from the top down to maintain the current social order for either personal profit or national profit that all goes to a Swiss bank account kind of thing. I think the way it's used colloquially is not necessarily helpful because everybody's going around calling people authoritarians now too. That shift seemed to happen once Biden got elected and the right started to be the, minority party. So that's interesting and fun. But yeah, I think that the way it's colloquially used isn't very helpful.
Sure.
But I think that there's a way that you can define it pretty exactly.
Okay. And to galaxy brain off of Andrew's question on Trump, to go even further back, Reagan, was he a fascist in hindsight?
In hindsight, he laid the groundwork for sure. Almost all of this in American culture stems from the 80s. And if it doesn't stem from the 80s, it comes from civil rights, baby. The second equality happens, problems happen. Honestly, a lot of Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism, even though I don't like totalitarianism as a tool, that book is very good. Something that she says in relation to rights and how it fuels political anger is really poignant, which if I can actually pull it up, I just will. Stop sharing my screen. Oh God, my face. And because in her mind, part of the reason why anti-Semitism becomes anti-Semitism and not just anti-Jew sentiment is because of political equality. And so once people are politically equal, you open the door to critiques happening to them that are unfair and based on who they are in a sort of very basic way, because equality demands people have rights at a fundamental level. And so once you have that, you can have fundamental violations of rights too. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. So for her, like, equality brought Jews, like, it stripped Jews of their protection that was traditional to them under the monarchies of Europe, where Jews would get allowances to do things and privileges. And so actually some Jews fought against equality and emancipation as a result, which is something that really pissed off Jewish readers of this book. But in reducing them to just like citizens, it meant that their conspicuous differences socially became more, I don't want to say vibrant, but they became more obvious and more offensive. So she says, like, neither oppression nor exploitation as such is ever the main cause for resentment. Wealth without visible function is much more intolerable because nobody can understand why it should be tolerated. And so when you have, and when Arendt's talking about Jews, once Jews lose their privileges, all they have to differentiate themselves from their fellow citizens is their wealth. And then that translates and becomes equated with Jewishness, which can help further popular hatreds. So if we go all the way back to civil rights, I think that's where you can read the start of American fascism. Because I think that while we had fascist movements in the 30s and 40s, part of the reason why I think they didn't work is because there was such an unequal relationship between like the nation, aka white people as those folks define them, and other people, that they couldn't get angry enough or become invested enough to become fully fascist.
So as the outgroup is no longer as much of an outgroup, it threatens.
Yeah, when the outgroup loses their definition as being out so that they can become, so that they lose like any privileges or differentiations and they become like whatever, they just become your neighbors or whatnot, then yeah, their conspicuous differences become less political than they do social. And once it becomes social, you can get really pissed at them. And then ironically, social becomes political again. I don't know. It's a hard book to sense, but that's sort of like how I think about it. I think that we can go all the way back to civil rights, but then to really answer your question, Reagan springboards off of that and galvanizes the religious right. And even though fascism in its European form was vaguely a-religious, like everybody seems to agree, even going back to the 30s and 40s, that if fascism is going to happen in America, it's going to be a Protestant clerical religious fascism.
Death cult, baby. Come on.
Yep.
You gotta rate it.
You love a good death cult.
I mean,
they're interesting. It's why I did all this reading.
So
I don't have a question.
Go ahead,
I was just gonna say, I don't have a question, Will. I was just going to say thank you. Very informative, very depressing.
Thanks for staying like an hour and a half after. But
yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Mooks. See ya.
So Will, I think I have an idea of a direction you could go forward with this. So as somebody who studies Eastern Europe, the narrative that always comes up is that once the Soviet Union fell, communism was doomed. Like that was it. You know, like Yugoslavia was doomed to fall apart once there was no more Soviet Union. And yet I'm going to bring back Iberian fascism back into this. After Nazi Germany and Italy are gone, you know, fascism continues on the Iberian Peninsula into the 70s and 80s.
Yep.
So this dominoes theory just falls apart again. So I think if you wanted a direction to go with your readings and for more research, what is it that it takes? Like, what are the requirements for a fascist regime to endure?
Yeah, and more importantly, does a fascist regime stay fascist? Because
excellent question.
Once it loses that fervor, right? And we talked about fascist radicalization once they're in power, but fascist atrophy, right? Once you lose the will to power, what happens to you when you're still in the seat of power?
Well, you can only mismanage stuff so long.
That's true.
before things fall apart.
Yeah, it is telling that both Franco's Spain and Salazar's Portugal ceased to be either of them when either of those people died, right? So there might just be something to be said for like the dictatorship principle in the terms of, does fascism just turn into authoritarianism, but with a new standard that it's trying to enforce rather than the old one? I don't know.
But I don't know if you've seen the chat, but second or third, whoever was saying another discussion of aesthetic and visual symbols and tools of fascism, because I think that was like very key to Trump being a viable candidate, having The Apprentice projecting him as a successful business owner. And I thought it was very interesting that fascism is a party of shopkeepers, while the GOP is seen as a party of small business.
Yeah. Yeah.
A very yikes.
Yeah, that's a big yikes moment for sure. I mean, the hats, you know, what hasn't been said about the red hats and the brown shirts and everything like that. So, yeah, I mean, his fixation on rallies, you know, and the pageantry of rallies, I think. It doesn't seem original anymore, but it doesn't mean it doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or just something to be viewed.
No, and I think that the most interesting thing about that is that Trump is somebody that theoretically has no commonalities with any of these people, and like as much as we liberals like to try to point that out, it has no impact. Whereas you look at like somebody like Mussolini or Hitler, they were deeply relatable to the people that they were actually mobilizing. They were both veterans. I mean,
well, apparently
hell,
Trump
well, yes, but
I mean, he's relatable enough as like, I don't know, something to aspire to. Like,
yeah, the aspirational model versus the like relatable model is really weird. I don't understand it, but you don't have to understand something that's irrational, right?
shrug emoji.
Who's to say? Wow, we sure have been talking. This has been going on for almost 2 damn hours, so I think it's only fair to give you back the rest of your evening, at least 10 minutes from now. But are there any other questions or comments that people would like to say before I just perfunctorily end this?
I might follow up with an email, but Will, this was fantastic. I'm really glad you hosted this. You know, you've been working very hard on this, and like, this was an academic level presentation.
Oh, thank you.
And you know, sometimes you're very humble for our Saturday night happy hours with the rest of us in our PhDs, but like, you can still hang, okay? Like, you would have put everybody else to shame in grad school if that's what you had wanted to do with your life.
And just to think, I did this on
really
company time.
I'm really glad to see you put your energies somewhere that's just really interesting, actually. And I've had such a good time listening to this. So thank you so much.
That means a lot. These thoughts have been just born into my noggin for months, and so I just sort of had to synthesize them somehow, and I guess exercise them by submitting everybody else to a verbal bludgeoning. So here we are.
Also, if it was said before I got on, thank you to Hannah Scuppum for hosting.
Yes.
As somebody with a university Zoom account, I'm very used to hosting Zoom calls for other people. So
I may have texted you both at the exact same time.
I feel like I don't hang out with Will's friends ever, so it's like exciting. I'm so excited to be here. So yeah.
Yes, thank you, Hannah. I'm happy that you are here as well.
So Will, this is only part 1 of a series, right?
What could part 2 possibly be, Greg?
How to punch.
How to
This
punch
is the
Nazis.
prologue.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right, everyone? This is just the prologue. We need to do more.
You can also have guest lectures about the Punic Wars, because apparently Andrew has thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
Season 1, 32 episodes. Let's bring hope.
32
Grind them
episodes
out.
with
Take a detour into the Punic Wars, please.
I mean, I'm ready. Like, you can tap me a coach.
Spencer's going to be my like late night sidekick who just gets white girl wasted and then just has a hot mic the entire time.
One of his best skills. He really brings it.
Yeah, I don't know. Ashley, anything to say? You've just been sitting there quietly with a vague smirk.
Lecture. I didn't come to. I went to summer camp college. I am not qualified to ask questions at this talk.
Well, I hope you found it useful.
I did. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, that means a lot. I hope it was accessible in any way. So and please tell me if it was accessible so I can make it impenetrable later. Em and Ari, anything on your end? I'm just calling on people now, which is completely unfair and perhaps even unethical.
Having recently lived with you, it's really fun to see these thoughts coming from you, like sunbathing with a Kindle and a cup of coffee, and then you're like sunburnt and you come in and you're like, okay, so this thing about fascism, and then it turned into this. It is really awesome.
And you're like, Will, do you have any aloe? And I'm like, nope. Well, hey, in that case, we'll end it here. Thank you for coming. This was fun for me, and I hope it was for you. Thanks to Hannah for letting people into the room, de facto moderator and host. Yeah. Oh, recordings to come. So if you want to be intolerably bored later, you can be on your own time. Great.
Great job, Will.
Great job.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. We'll end it here and have a good night.
All right. Good night, Will. Thank you.
Bye.